Hello Cinnamon Bun. Welcome to our next lesson of the Story Magic Academy on conflict. Now, every different piece of the plot embryo contains a crucial story element. Last week, we nailed down the internal quadrants of your plot embryo, which deal with theme. This week, we're going to look at the external quadrants, that middle ring of the plot embryo, which deals with conflict. You might have heard people go on and on about conflict and why it's so important in your stories, or this might be all new to you. Now, every part of a plot embryo is important, and every different section and element has its own crucial role and purpose, and they all work together to create a compelling story. But conflict might be the most important of all of these. Without theme, you'll have an empty or surface level story. Without a good backstory at plot point 1, it's hard for the audience to really connect with your protagonist. But without conflict, you don't really have a story at all. Without conflict, things might be happening on the page, but those things aren't story. So how does this show up in your stories? Well, conflict is absolutely crucial, but often it's hard to identify problems with conflict in our own writing. So you might feel like something's just off, something's not working, but you can't quite put your finger on what exactly that is. Your scenes maybe just feel deflated and boring or small and meaningless, and you can't really figure out why. It's this strange amorphous malaise, like story ennui. And when you feel this scene, or maybe this entire story is disappointing or lackluster or just plain dull, but you don't know why, it can be incredibly frustrating to try and fix that. You can keep cutting out different elements or adding different elements, changing the characters or the setting and the wording, but nothing seems to do the trick. Nothing seems to fix this scene. When this happens, your protagonist has fallen into conflict quicksand. So there are two kinds of what I call conflict quicksand, and almost all writers will experience either one or both of them at some point. The first kind of conflict quicksand is what I call untroubled story inertia. Jane wakes up, she looks at her alarm clock. It's 8:30 a.m. She gets out of bed. She makes some toast. She eats the toast. She gets changed out of her pajamas. She packs her bag and heads out to work. Work goes fine. She likes her job enough. Everything's okay and uneventful. She's happy where she is and she doesn't want anything more. She just floats on through her day and her life in a contented daze. Now, when we hear a scene like that, our brains are wired to think one of two things. One, okay, good for her, but that's not a story. Or two, okay, but when's the story going to start? Untroubled story inertia comes from a lack of any conflict. Jane is essentially not living any kind of story right now. All stories are parts of life, but not all of life is part of a story. And this is one of those gaps in between story where life just kind of ticks by without issues or setbacks. There's no conflict here. Jane doesn't want or need anything. She's not striving for anything in particular. And so her story is sort of deactivated. She's living, but she's not in the role of protagonist. Now, scene after scene of untroubled story inertia is mind-numbingly boring. It's boring for the audience, but it's often really boring for the writer too. Now, you might derive some pleasure from creating the textural details of such a scene, so lovingly describing how Jane makes her toast or her coffee, for instance. Because writing peace can be kind of soothing, but that pleasure does wear off the longer the untroubled story inertia goes on. You start to get this feeling that you and this character are simply treading water, hovering in limbo. And no matter how much you love describing the process of making toast, it begins to wear on you. It becomes boring and frustrating because ultimately what you're writing starts to feel meaningless. It's not building to anything, it's not in service of anything. You're just describing Jane making toast for the sake of it, because you don't know what else to do. The confusing part about untroubled story inertia is that any of the particular actions that your character is taking can be conflict in another context. We end up writing untroubled story inertia because we're used to seeing characters get up and make toast for themselves, and it's compelling. So we can look at our scene and a scene written by someone else, which has the character taking a lot of the same superficial actions, like making toast, and think, well, why does their scene work and mine doesn't? Like, what's missing? And what's missing is conflict. If making toast is part of a conflict, then a scene about making toast feels relevant, compelling, engaging, entertaining. What if, for instance, Jane is notoriously bad for skipping breakfast and she's trying to take better care of herself? What if she knows skipping breakfast leaves her tired and lacking energy throughout the whole morning, but breaking the habit is still really hard? A scene where Jane gets up and makes toast for herself and eats it is suddenly a lot more compelling because we've introduced conflict. So a scene with actual conflict revolving still around making toast might look something like this. The motive goal would be to eat breakfast in the morning. And the stakes would be that she wants to have more energy for the day and stop feeling so tired and dazed, which is affecting her work and her relationships. The conflict would be Jane's deeply ingrained habit of skipping breakfast. And we can also think about other conflicts which come to mind for this motive goal. So it's a habit already that she has, but what if other things go wrong to get in the way? What if she wakes up late? Then it's going to be much harder to eat breakfast in the morning. And finally, our resolution would be Jane fights the habit, makes some toast, and eats it. Success! Suddenly, we find ourselves cheering someone on for making toast for herself. Suddenly, instead of untroubled story inertia, this scene has conflict momentum. Jane has become a protagonist because she's striving for something, and there's something getting in her way. So how do we pull free of untroubled story inertia? The short answer is by incorporating solid conflict into our stories and scenes. With solid conflict, you can make almost any action or subject topic interesting, like making toast, for example. So that's exactly what I'm going to show you how to do in the rest of this lesson. But before we get into the second kind of conflict quicksand, you might be thinking, wait, am I not allowed any untroubled story inertia in my stories at all? What about pacing? What about giving my characters breathers and lulls? So the aim here is not to eliminate every single second of untroubled story inertia from your stories so that they're this constant wild ride of high velocity conflict momentum with no space to breathe. It is absolutely natural to have some brief lulls of story inertia dotted here and there. They give you and your character and your audience a place to catch your breath. And they're a great place for short, fun tangents and character building. As you're going to see in the rest of this lesson, the basic structure of story is a state of peace, and then moving into a conflict, and then going back to some kind of peace again. Another way to look at it is the comfort zone, then the conflict zone, and then going back to some kind of comfort zone. So these snippets of peace on either side are the right kind of story inertia. You want to be in this state of peace long enough to just see the kind of context so that we can understand what the conflict really means when we get into it, and then we want to see a little bit of peace on the other side of that. The point here is really just that we want to spend most of the time in our stories in the conflict. We're really just diving into these short kind of lulls and breathers, either to before a conflict begins or after a conflict has ended, to show what the situation is like before and then what it is like after. And this applies on both scales, on all scales of your story. So for the entire story itself, it's going to have this structure, peace, conflict, peace, and on a scene level as well, it's going to have that same structure of peace, conflict, peace. So if later on down the line, as you're drafting or revising or just reading through your story and it feels like it's starting to drag, or you find yourself skimming or getting bored, that is a big stop sign that you should really pay attention to. It means that this lull of story inertia, this section of peace is going on for too long. So you want to look for ways to shorten it and get into the next conflict more quickly. The real problem with untroubled story inertia is when your writing is mostly or even entirely made up of untroubled story inertia. So there's no conflict whatsoever. It's just this kind of constant state of peace. The second kind of conflict quicksand that it's incredibly easy to fall into is nuisance conflict. So this one feels a little bit different. Your protagonist is dealing with problems, you are throwing conflict at them. And while each individual scene might be engaging on its own, they feel kind of disconnected from each other. They don't really build on each other. It might feel like your protagonist is having a lot of bad days, but those bad days aren't coming together into a larger story. It can feel like the protagonist is putting out fires and dealing with a lot of minor inconveniences or hassles, but their real story hasn't started yet. Now, I personally wrote 30,000 words of nuisance conflict in my first draft for my novel, North of the End, and it is so frustrating because you're trying really hard to come up with interesting conflicts to throw in your protagonist's way, but it still never feels like you're getting into the meat of the story. They are still kind of treading water as they deal with one small problem and then another, and it still feels like the story is going nowhere. Nuisance conflict comes from a lack of clear central conflict for this story. The central conflict of any story should be a through line, connecting each scene so that they build on each other to one satisfying resolution. Without a clear central conflict, you end up telling a series of small episodic stories in each scene, instead of one bigger story throughout the entire project, whether that is a novel, a screenplay, a video game, a play, or anything else. So a TV show like The Simpsons is episodic. It's a collection of episode-long stories which use the same characters and world. But for the most part, the individual episodes are fairly disconnected from each other. The resolution of each episode resets to the status quo. This is so that you can enjoy an episode by itself, even if you haven't seen the preceding episodes. Now, episodic TV made sense when most people watch TV live, and you had to accept the fact that people wouldn't rearrange their schedules around catching the weekly episodes in order. So the episodes were small stories designed to be consumed in any order. Serialized TV, on the other hand, tells much longer form stories and is intended to be consumed in order to appreciate the whole story. So think bingeable Netflix shows which tell one big, complete story over a season. To take another animated example, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a great serialized show. While it does have the occasional tangent kind of filler episode, which feels more episodic, it tells one long-form complete story over 3 seasons. The story of Aang's quest to defeat the Fire Lord. Now, I love serialized stories for the depth that they get to explore, but neither episodic or serialized is better than the other. They're just different formats and sizes of stories, and they have their own pros and cons. It's not worse to tell episodic stories, but when we find ourselves writing nuisance conflict, what's happened is that we've lapsed into episodic storytelling in each scene when we were trying to tell a serialized story across those scenes. So our scenes have become like standalone episodes instead of building up one larger story throughout the whole project. And this can feel really frustrating. We set out to write a novel, and instead it feels like we're writing a series of short stories. We set out to write a feature-length screenplay, and instead it feels like we're writing 20-minute episodes. So, how do we fix nuisance conflict? Well, do you remember the fractal pattern of story structure from lesson 3? So when we get bogged down in nuisance conflict, we're thinking of our conflict at the wrong scale. We're at this scale 2, at the scene level. We're writing each scene as its own standalone story. Instead, we need to zoom out and first clarify the central conflict for the story as a whole. We need to be at scale 0. Once we're clear on that, we can start breaking it down into smaller conflicts for individual scenes. So think of a scene conflict as, will the protagonist survive this fight? And think of the central conflict as that overarching umbrella for all the fights. So it's more like, will the protagonist win the war? We fix nuisance conflict by creating a strong central conflict which spans the entire story. So this central conflict creates that through line of tension which connects each scene, allowing them to build on each other to a satisfying climax. So let's now look at how conflict works in the plot embryo. Most of us are familiar with the idea of a story as a journey. We may be familiar with the hero's journey, which is the conceptual ancestor of the plot embryo, but sometimes the word journey itself can make us think of a physical journey, of physically travelling from one place to another. But a story is a journey through conflict. In the plot embryo, this metaphorical journey is mapped out spatially. So the protagonist starts here in their comfort zone. They travel across the threshold into the conflict zone, and eventually they come out the other side of that conflict. And whether they come out the other side of this conflict better than when they went in, or worse, is what makes a heroic story versus a tragic one. So let's take this middle ring of the plot embryo, the comfort zone and the conflict zone. Let's remove it from the context of the plot embryo and look at it by itself in a little bit more detail. So on the top here we have the comfort zone, and on the bottom here we have the conflict zone. Now these also have little shorthand names, like we had for our internal quadrants as well. So we have QC for the comfort zone and QD for the conflict zone. Don't worry about them right now, but they're going to come in handy later on. So there are lots of different ways to kind of describe and think of these two quadrants. So you can think of the comfort zone as stasis, or a place where stasis is happening, and the conflict zone as a place where growth happens. The comfort zone, obviously, is a place of comfort, which means that the conflict zone is often a place of discomfort. And the one that you hear pretty often when you're talking about the hero's journey is that the comfort zone is a familiar situation to the protagonist, whereas the conflict zone is an unfamiliar situation. And similarly, the comfort zone is a place of the known versus the conflict zone being a place of the unknown. And finally, we have that the comfort zone is a state of peace, whereas the conflict zone, obviously, is a state of conflict. So to kind of sum up, the comfort zone, this is a situation where the protagonist really knows the rules of the game. They're comfortable, they might not be happy, but at least they know what to expect in the comfort zone. And that is, in its own way, comforting. Now the main problem that comes up in the comfort zone is stagnation or inertia. Conflict zone, on the other hand, the protagonist has now entered a conflict situation, a game where they don't know the rules, they don't know how to successfully navigate this situation. And the main problem here is unfamiliar conflict. So they no longer know what to expect, and that is pretty scary. So now I just want to put to rest a couple of common misconceptions about the comfort zone and the conflict zone that I see out and about in the wild. The first one is that the comfort and conflict zones are physical places. This is not true. I have seen people talking about these quadrants, the comfort zone, the conflict zone, the familiar and the unfamiliar, whatever you want to call them, as settings or physical environments. That is not the case. Now, especially in fantasy stories, the conflict zone often can be housed in an unfamiliar place. So the character might actually go on a physical journey. But the place that they are in is only the conflict zone insofar as it presents them with an unfamiliar situation that they haven't navigated before. So both zones are situations, not places. So for instance, let's say you have a story where the protagonist stays in their home the entire story. You know, maybe the story is about them having a new flatmate or roommate moving in with them, and that person brings new things into this place, into this home that they know really well. They create a new situation for the protagonist to navigate. So does the new flatmate leave things lying around? Do they throw lots of parties? These are new circumstances in the same old place. So the new flatmate creates an unfamiliar situation within a familiar environment. The second common misconception that sometimes comes up is that comfort zones need to be relatable to the audience, not weird or fantastical. And again, this is not the case. The truth is that the comfort zone only needs to be ordinary, familiar, and normal to the protagonist, not to us as the writer or not to the audience. So in Lord of the Rings, for instance, living peacefully in the Shire is a fantastical situation to us as the audience. But of course, that is very familiar, that's normality, to the hobbits. In Star Wars, living on the planet Tatooine, obviously, is completely alien to us. But it's familiar, it's normality to Luke Skywalker, so it's his comfort zone. Next, we're going to look at why the conflict zone sometimes goes by another name. The growth zone. We've already seen in our lesson on the universal pattern that the plot embryo is change. It is adaptation. Conflict is the catalyst for that change. It's through navigating conflict that the protagonist is forced to adapt and grow. Now, the idea of the growth zone can be a really helpful concept for two reasons. So firstly, it's a really common stumbling block for a lot of writers when we first start to use this idea of the comfort zone and the conflict zone, that we can really grasp the idea of leaving your comfort zone. So like crossing this threshold here and venturing into the unknown, into this unfamiliar conflict. That is usually a fairly easy concept to grasp, but a lot of us struggle with its opposite point, so that's plot point 3, sorry, plot point 7, that's 3. So a lot of us struggle with this point here, crossing from the conflict zone back into the comfort zone. It seems like that my protagonist has already gone through the conflict. They've grown, they've changed, they've undergone their arc. So like, why would they go back to their old comfort zone? Why? It doesn't make sense for them to go back to their old life. Isn't this a step backwards for them? Now, plot point 7 and this kind of concept of crossing from the conflict zone into the comfort zone used to trip me up a lot too. But the growth zone, this concept of the growth zone, really helped me understand that in a totally new way. Now, the other benefit of this concept of the growth zone is outside of storytelling. This concept is really helpful in real life. It helps us develop our characters, but it can also help us develop ourselves. So the growth zone is a way of looking at the conflict zone, which is really helpful, and it came to me from a pretty unexpected source. It actually came to me from a YouTube video by Marie Forleo, who was giving advice to a business owner who was afraid to hire their first staff member. Now, I'm going to link that video below this lesson if you'd like to see the whole thing. I definitely recommend that you do. But I'm also going to pull out the standout part about the growth zone that really showed me this concept. So this is what Marie said about the growth zone in that video. Here in the comfort zone, which is where many of us live, things feel safe. They feel known. Even if things are stressful and unpleasant, at least we feel secure in the fact that it's familiar. Now, many of us stay here in the comfort zone way too long. So long, in fact, that we start to kill the very things we love. But see, all the good stuff in business and in life exists outside of it, here in the growth zone, which is also known as the discomfort zone. And as we know, can also be called the conflict zone. So yes, things will be uncomfortable at first. It's scary, you feel really vulnerable and insecure because you don't know what the hell you're doing. But if you're able to hang out there in the growth zone, then you learn that's where all the magic happens. That's where you face your fears, that's where you get stronger, that's where you gain all kinds of new skills and confidence and capabilities. That is where you get to make a bigger difference to others. And then guess what happens? All of a sudden, that growth zone becomes your new comfort zone. Everything that used to be so scary and unknown is like, I got this. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. And now everything outside that is your new growth zone. So if you watch the video linked below, and I recommend that you do, you'll see that Marie talks about how she actively tries to stay in her own growth zone or discomfort zone as much as possible, because she knows that that is how you adapt, that's how you grow, and that's how you succeed in life. But it takes being willing to be uncomfortable. So let's look at the plot embryo again. So what can this idea of the growth zone teach us or show us about what is happening here at plot point 7? Our first instinct is probably that at plot point 7, the return, that means that the protagonist is moving back, traveling back into their comfort zone. But what is actually happening here is that the protagonist isn't moving at all. It's simply that this is the moment where their comfort zone expands to encompass what was previously their growth zone or their conflict zone. So they are back in their comfort zone, but not because they've moved, simply because their comfort zone has expanded to include where they're at. Their new comfort zone encompasses all of the new situations that they encountered over the course of the story. They were unfamiliar, but now they've done it, and so they're not unfamiliar anymore. So actually, a more accurate way of kind of representing these external quadrants, instead of it just being the comfort zone and the conflict zone, might be more like this. In 3. So we have the old comfort zone, the conflict or growth zone, and then a new expanded comfort zone. So if you've ever heard about plot point 8 being where the protagonist becomes master of both worlds, this is what that means. They start out as master of their old comfort zone, they venture into the conflict zone or the growth zone where they're certainly not a master of it, they don't know how to navigate it, but they do learn over the course of the story so that by the end they are master of both zones, which combine into that one big new expanded comfort zone. Seeing it this way was a huge game changer for me, and I hope it is for you too. So we've talked a lot about the theory here, the comfort zone, the conflict zone, why we need a strong central conflict for our story. So how do we actually create those things for ourselves? How do we nail down that central conflict, which is going to keep us from sinking into conflict quicksand? Well, we're going to use what I call the potent conflict recipe. So the potent conflict recipe is a 3-step process. Step 1, create conflicting motive goals. Step 2, identify the antagonist. And step 3, turn it into a conflict zone. Going through the steps of the potent conflict recipe will be your assignment for this week. So far, we've spoken about conflict in a fairly one-sided way, as if it's kind of like this wall that springs out of the ground to stop the protagonist from getting what they want and satisfying their motive goal. But the truth is, a protagonist can't just have a conflict by themselves. They can't be in conflict by themselves. They can't be in conflict without something to be in conflict with. Conflict is a relationship between two things. To have a conflict is to be in a state of conflict with something else. Now, as writers, we throw the word conflict around quite a lot, and so it gets a lot of different connotations attached to it, and it can start to lose its meaning a little bit. So let's sharpen up the idea by going back to basics, back to the root, and look at the dictionary definition of conflict. So first we have the noun conflict, as in a conflict. A serious incompatibility between two or more opinions, principles, or interests. A serious disagreement or argument. And then we have a state of mind in which someone experiences a clash of opposing feelings or needs, and a prolonged armed struggle. So these all really are different kinds of conflict. The first one, a serious incompatibility between two or more opinions, principles, or interests, that's a kind of general definition of what conflict is. The second one here, a serious disagreement or argument, is an ideological conflict between people. So interpersonal kind of ideological conflict. And then a state of mind in which someone experiences a clash of opposing feelings or needs, that's ideological conflict in one person, internal conflict. And then finally, a prolonged armed struggle is physical, violent conflict. And then we have the verb, to conflict. And our definition is to be incompatible or at variance, clash. So conflict is a relationship between two things. That might be two ideas, two needs in different people, or two needs in the same person. Might be two people, might be two nations. If we have two sentences in conflict with each other, that means that their relationship is to contradict each other. They can't both be true at the same time. If we have two people in conflict with each other, that means that they have interests, opinions, goals, or intentions which can't both be satisfied simultaneously. So there are only three ways to actually end any conflict, in real life and in stories. The first is to show that there is actually a way for both sides to be satisfied. So this is really showing that what was perceived as a true conflict is not actually a true conflict, because both sides can be satisfied simultaneously. It's just that the solution wasn't immediately available. So I would say that this is actually a perceived conflict rather than a true conflict. The second way to resolve a conflict is for one side to give up their motive, goal, their stance or interest, or their position really. So in this case, one side is kind of forfeiting to withdraw from the conflict, which resolves it. And the other side kind of wins, I suppose, by default. And the third way for a conflict to be resolved, a true conflict, is that one side has to win and is satisfied and the opposing side loses, so they are unsatisfied or disproven. So these are the only three ways that we can resolve any conflict. Now, so far I've had you focus pretty deeply on one side of the conflict of your story, the protagonist's side. But there are two sides to every conflict, and now it's time to look in the other direction, the antagonist. Every story is actually two stories. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the idiom, there are two sides to every story. But what I don't mean by this is that both sides always have a point, or that the middle ground is always the best, or that both sides of a conflict should always get equal sympathy. I'm not talking here about centrism or moderation. I mean, literally, the lifeblood of a story is conflict, and conflict always has at least two sides. A story always has duality, and there are always choices to be made about perspective. So how do we decide to split our focus between the two sides of a conflict? That is a stylistic decision. To tell any story, we're forced to pick a perspective. Every story is actually two stories, and so every plot embryo is actually two plot embryos. But even if we decide to only show the winner's side of the story, so that would be the protagonist of the heroic plot embryo, the tragic flip side of that story is always intrinsically woven into it and can't be removed. It still exists even if we aren't shining a light on it or looking in that direction. Every complete heroic plot embryo, no matter how much we've consciously given thought to the antagonist, already has this shadowy underside woven into it, simply because to create a plot embryo, you need conflict, and conflict always has two sides. The conflict zone is the state of conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. Let me say that again. The conflict zone is the state of conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. It's as simple as that, and it's as complicated as that. But don't worry, there is an incredibly straightforward way to create that conflict. And we do this by giving them conflicting motive goals. The protagonist needs one thing, and the antagonist needs something else. But their motive goals and the rules of the story universe are such that they can't both get what they want. So for instance, Thanos wants the Infinity Gauntlet to snap half of life in the universe into oblivion. The Avengers want to stop him and keep all life safe. They want to prevent the snap. Now these goals have true conflict because they can't both be satisfied or be true at the same time. So you can't have a universe in which both half of life is destroyed and half of life isn't destroyed. That's a logical contradiction. So Thanos and the Avengers have a strong antagonistic relationship. They have a strong conflict with each other. So to create a really solid conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist, we purposefully create their motive goals, their interests, their intentions to inherently conflict with each other from the get-go. We make sure that there is no way that their motive goals can be satisfied or made real simultaneously. So for both goals to be true at the same time would be a logical contradiction, like saying the sky is blue and the sky is not blue. Now, the easiest way to do this, to create our conflicting motive goals, is to brainstorm their motive goals side by side, just like we did with our thesis and antithesis. Brainstorming our motive goals side by side like this allows us to see if they truly contradict each other, to see if they are in true conflict with each other. And we can actually do this. We can do this process of creating our conflicting motive goals before we have any idea who or what the antagonist actually is. In fact, the reason that this step, creating conflicting motive goals, is the first step of our potent conflict recipe is because it's often easiest to decide the antagonist's motive goal first and then build the rest of the antagonist around that. So, this is the worksheet that you're going to use to create your conflicting motive goals. So you should already have some rough ideas for your protagonist motive goal from the story seed that you chose, because one of the ingredients in our story seed was some ideas for motive goals. So you're not committed to any of the ones that you came up with in your story seed, but you can feel free to include them here and to build on them. So you could even start this exercise by inputting the motive goal ideas that you had from your story seed, and then exploring maybe other options after that. So here is how you create these conflicting motive goals. This is how you use this worksheet. So this sheet is divided into two columns. One side is for brainstorming our protagonist motive goals, and the other side is for the antagonist. This little section up here at the top with the question mark is a space to write a magic question. So you could write one magic question on one side and leave the other blank, or you could do both. And then these lines here are where you're going to be doing your brainstorming. So the first step is to pick a magic question. So here are the magic questions that you can choose from. These ones are actually all for the protagonist, but you can easily just change the wording to make them for the antagonist. What is the biggest quest that the protagonist is on in this story? What is the biggest goal or objective the protagonist has over the course of this story? What quest is this story mainly about? What is the protagonist trying to achieve on this journey? What need or desire will force the protagonist to journey out of their comfort zone? So these magic questions will be included on your assignment PDF, and I want you to read through them and pick the one that resonates the most with you. The one that is closest to how you would ask this question in your own voice. And I want you to write that in here, in the space for protagonist motive goal ideas. Now you'll notice in all of these questions, I've just said the protagonist here, because obviously this is very early stages and it's likely for most of us our protagonist doesn't have a name yet. Now, some of you might already have names for your protagonist for this story. It might have just come to you, or maybe you're a bit of an eager beaver and you decided what you wanted it to be already. If that is the case, I want you, as you're writing out this question, to replace the protagonist with the name that you have chosen. So it would be, what is the biggest quest Delilah is on in this story? Or what is the biggest quest David is on in this story? Now that is completely optional, and only do that if you already have that information. For most of us, we're not going to have the protagonist's name at this stage. We're actually going to get to that in a future lesson, and I'm going to show you exactly how to decide it and when is a good time to do that. But for now, if you have that information already, we might as well use it here. And step number 2 is to start brainstorming. So the way that we want to do this is that we want to always be brainstorming pairs of motive goals. We don't want to have one motive goal by itself. We need both of them. So it doesn't really matter which side we start on, like which motive goal we start with and then how we figure out the conflicting one. But because we are working on the protagonist's plot embryo right now, that's why we're using the magic question in the protagonist side. And the motive goal ideas that you have in your story seed should all be for the protagonist. So we're going to start on the protagonist side and then use that to figure out what the antagonists might be. So for instance, so let's say my first idea for a motive goal for the protagonist is to open a coffee shop. I guess we could make it a little bit more specific and say to successfully open a coffee shop. Now that we've got one motive goal in here, we want to think about what could the antagonist's motive goal be, which would conflict with that. So it could be to sabotage the coffee shop and prevent it from opening. Now, if you have multiple ideas for different motive goals that the antagonist could have, which would all conflict with this one, then you can just kind of do a little list. So my second idea, which conflicts with this, to successfully open a coffee shop versus to stop any competitor coffee shops opening on their street. So we can just kind of continue a list here. Once we've finished brainstorming this particular motive goal, we can just kind of separate it from the next one by doing like a line or something. It's not super essential, but it's helpful. And then we're just going to keep brainstorming different motive goal ideas. So every time we come up with a motive goal on this side, we're going to then use that, we're going to ask ourselves, what would conflict with that? What would the opposite of that goal be? What goal could someone have that would conflict with that? So that's basically how we want to move down this sheet and continue brainstorming our motive goals. Now, the way that we're doing things, as I said, because we're focused on the protagonist plot embryo for the moment, most of the time you're going to be starting in this column and then using that to figure out what the antagonist would be, but you don't have to. So you might actually have an idea first. So a pretty cheesy, cliche villain motive goal here: take over the world and rule it as a dictator. And our conflicting motive goal for that, for the protagonist, could just be stop the antagonist taking over the world. So when you're brainstorming motive goals in general, you want to try and be quite specific. We always want to try and describe like the real world situation or state of affairs that this character is trying to bring about. So what set of circumstances are they trying to make real? So for instance, the motive goal to be happy and successful isn't really specific enough. Obviously, most of us, all of us want to be happy and successful, but what that means to any given person is really, really different. So what kind of happiness, what kind of success is this person looking for? So if we were going to make that more specific, we could go in a direction like, so a more specific version of that could be to become a successful artist and to feel content and happy with their creative life. Now, obviously, what it means to become a successful artist is still kind of vague. So I guess let's assume that this is a visual artist. So let's say a painter or something. So we can go even more specific and say that what it means to be a successful artist in this person's eyes is to make a comfortable living as a full-time painter. So not to be a millionaire, not to be like, you know, world famous, but just to make a comfortable living doing painting full-time and enjoy their work most of the time. So that's the happiness part. So that is the kind of specificity and detail that we're looking to get to when it comes to motive goals. And just to brainstorm a conflicting motive goal for that. So obviously this is a really personal motive goal. So coming up with a conflicting motive goal for the antagonist can be a little bit more tricky because it makes us think, well, the antagonist then surely has to want to ruin this person's life or prevent them from making a comfortable living as a full-time painter and enjoying their work. So I'm really thinking about like what kinds of things stand in the way of achieving this. And I guess this is getting a little bit abstract, but to me, an antagonist for this kind of story would almost be like the entire system which is set up to make achieving this really difficult. So yeah, it could be things like the gig economy, the way taxes work for small businesses and for artists and artisans. I mean, just because everything always comes back to capitalism, but capitalism. Okay, so I'm going to say that the antagonist for this is going to just be generally the societal system which is hostile to this kind of life, or makes it quite difficult. And so that system's motive goal might be... So my first crack at a motive goal for this is get everyone employed, generating profit for big companies, not providing for themselves creatively. So I've created kind of a tricky motive goal here to actually generate antagonist ones from, but hopefully you get the idea. I would probably continue brainstorming antagonist motive goals on this side for this one, but I'll leave it there for now. So that's how we're going to brainstorm. So as we're going through this process and we're generating these new motive goals, here's the kind of thought process that we want to be going through. We want to be asking ourselves, for any new pair, can these two goals or intentions be satisfied at the same time? Is there any way that these two could both get what they want? Is there any way that both of these desired situations could be made real simultaneously? So are these desires or these desired situations mutually exclusive? Now, if you have thoughts or notes on a particular pair of motive goals, you can actually make notes on your own brainstorming with another coloured pen to kind of distinguish it from the content of the brainstorm itself. So I might say that this one is more specific and I like it better. So for this one, win an Olympic gold medal in X, a particular sport, versus the antagonist also wanting to win that same gold medal, which obviously is conflicting goals even though it's the same goal. The second one that I came up with was to prevent the protagonist from winning gold in that particular sport. So I might say that this one feels a bit far-fetched, or maybe that this one kind of implies a bit of a revenge story where someone is setting out just to ruin someone else's life, which I'm maybe not as interested in. You know, maybe I am more interested in this kind of clean competition of two people competing for the same thing. So for step number 4, you're going to keep going until you find a pair of motive goals that you want to centre your story around. So during this process, you're going to probably come up with 3 different kinds of pairs of motive goals. So you'll have pairs which don't work. So this means that when you ask yourself these questions, you can see that they aren't actually in true conflict with each other. So there is a way, however slim, that both goals could be satisfied at the same time. Then you'll end up with pairs which work, but you don't like them. So you can see that these motive goals are in true conflict with each other, but you just don't really like them for some reason. It might be that it's just not the kind of story that you're interested in telling, or maybe one of the goals feels a bit too outlandish or too far from real life, or any other reason. And eventually you'll get to pairs which work and you do like them. So you've verified that these are in true conflict with each other and you feel good about them. It feels like they might make an interesting story and you're interested to see how this conflict might play out. Now, this doesn't need to feel like head over heels joy and excitement just at seeing this pair of motive goals. You're still laying groundwork here, and the goals will become much more exciting when we start to add backstory and stakes. So when you get to the first pair, which works and you do like them, you can stop there and you can decide that that is the pair that you're going to choose. That is the pair of conflicting motive goals that you are choosing for this story and that you're going to move forward with. Or you can continue brainstorming until you have a couple of pairs or a few pairs which work and you like them, and then choose between them. Here are 2 things that you don't need to know or decide while you do this exercise. Firstly, you do not need to know why anyone has this particular motive goal. At this stage, for both your protagonist and your antagonist, you don't need to know why it matters to them, why they want it, or the reason that they're going after this particular thing. That comes later. Just remember that no matter which motive goals you choose, we have a process for creating compelling backstory, stakes, and reasons for why they want this motive goal, no matter what it is. You can always come up with a reason why a character wants this particular motive goal, but we're not there yet, so be patient. And don't give yourself extra work trying to figure out why someone might hold this particular motive goal as you're brainstorming through each one. All you need to know at this stage is what they want, not why they want it. And secondly, you don't need to know the identity of the antagonist. So if you have an idea for your antagonist already, you can work with that. That is totally fine. Any existing ideas that you have, you can work with, of course, but you do not need one at this stage. In fact, it's often easier to nail down the antagonist's motive goal first and then build their identity, their backstory, and everything else around that. So that's the order in which we're going to do things here. As you're brainstorming your conflicting motive goals, just remember that you don't need to know why anyone has this motive goal, and you don't need to know the identity of the antagonist. And the other reason that you don't need to know the identity of the antagonist while you're doing this exercise is that identifying the antagonist is our next exercise. Step 2 of the potent conflict recipe is identifying the antagonist. So you've chosen your pair of conflicting motive goals. Now it's time to figure out the identity of your antagonist. You may be familiar with the idea that an antagonist can be a person, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes more abstract things can be antagonists. Now, in our upcoming lesson, Creating a Protagonist, we're going to dive into the nuts and bolts of what exactly makes a protagonist or antagonist, and the full spectrum of people, groups, and different entities which can fill these roles. For the purposes of helping you identify your antagonist at this stage, so that we can keep moving forward in this lesson, I've got a little shortcut that you can use to identify your antagonist, even if it's something more abstract than a person. Now, how difficult it is to identify the antagonist really is variable story to story. Sometimes you'll be working on a story and identifying the antagonist is really simple and really easy. It just comes to you. You don't have to even do any brainstorming, but sometimes it can be a lot more difficult. So I want to show you what to do in those cases where it's a little bit more complicated. So here's how to brainstorm possible antagonists. This is pretty simple once we have those two conflicting motive goals, which make up the central conflict for this story. So to brainstorm your possible antagonists, you're going to get to a new page in your brainstorming notebook or on a piece of paper, and you're going to write down this magic question. So here's your magic question. Which people, groups, or entities might have, and this is a space for you to write down your chosen antagonist motive goal as a goal, intention, or imperative. So this here is what I call a magic question slot. And we're going to get into that in a bit more detail in future lessons. But for now, all you need to know is that you're going to take the antagonist motive goal that you've chosen and write it into this magic question on your blank piece of paper or on your blank page. So for instance, this question might become, which people, groups, or entities might have win an Olympic gold medal in swimming as a goal, intention, or imperative? So you're going to do this brainstorm in either mind map or list format, and you're going to limit your brainstorm by either stopping when you fill the page or by setting a timer and stopping when it's done. So remember and take breaks in between brainstorms and continue until you've hit on an antagonist that you would like to use for this story. Now, as you do this, you may have ideas for why they want that motive goal. Again, you can note these down as you go, but you don't have to pick one or decide on one at this stage. So possible antagonists who are people will have a pretty straightforward relationship with this motive goal. More abstract entities are going to have a bit more of an unorthodox relationship with motive goals. So for instance, if the chosen antagonist motive goal was to destroy the city, now you could come up with human antagonists with this goal, but you might also come up with the antagonist of a hurricane. So that's an entity, obviously, rather than a person. Now, of course, a hurricane doesn't have the conscious motive goal in the same way that a person does. But destroy the city, that motive goal could be an imperative for a hurricane if the city lies in its path. So you could say that it needs to fulfill its natural imperative of moving along its path before eventually dissipating, because the laws of nature demand that it does. And so the hurricane in that instance could be your antagonist. Now, I know this can get a little bit murky, so I've got a quick tip for you on how to figure out if any given thing, any given entity or group or whatever it is, works as an antagonist. So sometimes you're going to have ideas for antagonists out with the context of brainstorming this magic question. Obviously, that's not the only time that you're ever going to be thinking about antagonists. And sometimes, even with possible antagonists that you can generate from this brainstorm, you might still be unsure if this thing really works as an antagonist. So this is a really quick gut check shortcut to help you figure out if what you have in mind can actually function properly as an antagonist in this story. So this is our yardstick. Your antagonist can be any person, any group of people, or any entity, as long as it can hold the motive goal you've chosen. Can this thing hold the motive goal that you've chosen? A lot of the time, if you ask yourself that question, you'll just know the answer instantly. Your gut will tell you, you'll kind of hear it in your mind. But there are times where it's a bit more naughty and you don't immediately just know. So, in those cases, I want you to try doing a 10-minute mind map brainstorm on this magic question. Can insert your possible antagonist here have the motive goal of insert your chosen motive goal here? So when you fill those slots, your magic question might look something like this. Can a hurricane have the motive goal of destroying the city? And my instinct here is yes. Not in the same way that a person has a motive goal, but in some sense, yes. So this is how we brainstorm our possible antagonists. This is how we figure out if any given entity or thing works as an antagonist. So let's talk about how we make that final decision on the identity of the antagonist. Ultimately, making your final decision on the identity of the antagonist is about picking which version of the story interests you. But there are a couple of stumbling blocks to watch out for. So the first stumbling block when it comes to choosing the antagonist is picking the wrong scale. So this is a kind of layout of what the relationship between the protagonists and antagonists might look like across the entire series of Avengers movies. So under the kind of umbrella of Thanos as the central antagonist, we also have characters that work on his behalf. So we have Loki in the first Avengers movie, we have Ronan the Accuser, and surely you also remember some of these classic minor antagonists who apparently actually have names and I had no idea. We have Dehydrated Elf, Shark Man who didn't pass his exams, Melodramatic Goth Queen of my heart, and a Disgruntled Trout. So Thanos is the central antagonist here because he is the one with the motive goal which conflicts with the Avengers' motive goal. Or at least this motive goal starts with him. But he's got resources, so he's got henchmen, he's got minions, he's got an army. Does that mean that the Avengers movies have a lot of antagonists instead of one? No, because his people are working for him to carry out his motive goal of getting the Infinity Gauntlet, snapping half of life out of existence. And so Thanos' resources and the people working on his behalf count as part of him as an antagonist. So when the Avengers are fighting his army, they're still fighting him. In a scene where the Avengers are fighting one of these characters, they're actually fighting a minor antagonist. These are the antagonists of particular scenes or arcs, but they operate under this umbrella of Thanos, who is the central antagonist for this entire story. And the same is true of other kinds of resources, not just characters. So if the antagonist has a big death ray machine, that machine isn't another central antagonist for the protagonist to fight or struggle against. It's a resource that the central antagonist is using to try and achieve their motive goal. So fighting or neutralizing that machine is still part of fighting that same antagonist. So the question that we want to keep in mind here is this possible antagonist that I'm considering a central antagonist for this entire story, or are they a minor antagonist which creates conflict only in particular scenes? Because for the moment, we really need a central antagonist. Minor antagonists, if we want to use them, can come later. Stumbling block number 2 in choosing your antagonist is morality. Antagonists don't have to be evil. So when you created your conflicting motive goals, the page is literally split in two. Creating conflict is literally about creating two sides. So, whose side are we on? Do we have to pick a side? I want you to understand that protagonist versus antagonist is something very different from hero versus villain. Hero and villain are archetypes. These words are normative. They imply morality. They imply what kind of person the character is. Are they pure of heart or are they totally evil? Protagonist and antagonist, on the other hand, aren't archetypes. They are roles. They are roles a character plays in a story. And the words protagonist and antagonist have a very precise meaning in the Plot Embryo system, in the Story Magic Academy system. Protagonist, noun. The character or entity which undergoes the journey of this plot embryo through conflict with the antagonist. So when we say a character or an entity is the protagonist, what we're saying is we're talking about their plot embryo. If we say a character or an entity is a protagonist, then all we're saying there is that they have their own plot embryo. But we're not talking about that plot embryo right now. And our definition of antagonist: the central character or entity which is in true conflict with the protagonist of this plot embryo. So again, when we refer to a character or an entity as the antagonist, we're saying that they're the antagonist of this plot embryo. If we say they're an antagonist, then we either mean that they're a minor antagonist for this plot embryo, or they play the role of antagonist in a different plot embryo, but not the one that we are talking about here. Now, because a protagonist and antagonist are roles and not archetypes, there are absolutely no storytelling rules on what kinds of archetypes or what kinds of characters can fulfill either of these roles of protagonist or antagonist. You can have a protagonist that completely fits the hero archetype or the villain archetype, or neither. And which you choose is really an ideological choice. So if someone writes a story with a neo-Nazi as a protagonist, and the story uncritically endorses his views and presents him as a hero, I will criticise the ideology of that story. But it's not inherently bad storytelling to have a neo-Nazi as a protagonist. It really depends what you do with that character. You can write a story which itself criticises neo-Nazi ideology with a neo-Nazi as a protagonist. And usually you do that with a tragic plot embryo. So a protagonist does not have to be morally correct, admirable, or sympathetic. And an antagonist does not have to be morally incorrect, detestable, or unsympathetic. You have so much more freedom than that. You are free to pick a side of your story conflict, or you can pick both sides and explore complex duality. Now, a great example of storytelling which picks both sides is in the Netflix show She-Ra. So Adora, or She-Ra, is our typical hero archetype, and her antagonist, Catra, meets a lot of the qualities for the villain archetype. But the story in the show is actually presented from both their perspectives, and really allows Catra to be the space to be a protagonist in her own right, in a way that you don't often see in kids' TV or like family-orientated TV. So part of what makes the conflict between these two so incredibly intense in the first season of this show is that we're given the opportunity to develop equal sympathy and attachment to both characters in this conflict, to both sides of this conflict. So their plot embryos would look something like this. So, here are our two plot embryos, these two sides of this one conflict. Now, the reason we have this heroic and tragic combo is because of what we said earlier about the only way to resolve a conflict, a true conflict, is for either one side to forfeit and give up their motive goal and kind of withdraw from the conflict, or for one side to win and the other to lose, in some sense. And that's what is playing out here. Adora wins, Catra loses. So in Catra's plot embryo, of course, she is the protagonist of her own plot embryo, and she is a tragic protagonist because her plot embryo is tragic. That's what makes her a tragic protagonist. And now Catra's antagonist is Adora, and because Catra is a tragic protagonist, that means that her antagonist is heroic. And heroic here just means that Adora is the protagonist of a heroic plot embryo, that she has a heroic plot embryo. And then on the flip side, and then on Adora's side, obviously she is the protagonist of her own plot embryo. She gets her heroic, positive, happy ending, so she is a heroic protagonist, and then her antagonist is Catra, and Catra loses her side of the conflict, and so she's a tragic antagonist in the context of Adora's plot embryo. Now, a quick note about the wording here, because I know that calling this a heroic plot embryo and this a tragic plot embryo can be a little bit confusing. So when I began using the tragic plot embryo, when I created that concept, I then suddenly had to give a name to the traditional non-tragic plot embryo that we all know and love. Now, because it's loosely based on the hero's journey, I started calling it the heroic plot embryo. But it was only later that I realised how important it is to separate protagonist and antagonist from hero and villain. And by then, it was a little bit too late to rename it. So you can think of the heroic plot embryo as a positive plot embryo. The character grows, they get an ultimately positive ending. And the tragic plot embryo as the negative plot embryo. The character loses their side of the conflict and they don't really grow or change adequately. They might even get worse. So just remember that when I say heroic plot embryo or heroic antagonist, all I mean by that is that it is the one with the positive ending and the 8 plot points. It doesn't mean that the protagonist of a heroic plot embryo needs to fulfill the archetype of a hero. They don't need to be a heroic character in terms of being pure of heart and strong and all that kind of stuff that goes along with the archetype. It just means that their plot embryo is ultimately positive and has the 8 plot points, that traditional structure. So when I say that the labels of protagonist and antagonist are relative, this is what I mean. When we say that Adora is the protagonist, all that means is that we're talking about her plot embryo. So we're kind of focusing on her point of view, her arc, her side of this conflict. Now, she may or may not be portrayed sympathetically, but this is her side of the story. Catra becomes the antagonist simply because she's who is in conflict with Adora here. But we can do the same thing the other way around. If we say that Catra is the protagonist, then we're staking a claim in her point of view. We're saying that we're talking about her plot embryo, and Adora becomes the antagonist by default. So separating these roles of protagonist and antagonist from hero and villain can give us endless creative freedom in our stories in terms of point of view, ideology, morality, sympathy, and empathy. Now, to wrap up all this chat about protagonist and antagonist, perspective, duality, morality, I want to give a quick aside. If you are interested in more stories which play with this duality, The Girl Who Would Be King by Kelly Thompson does this absolutely beautifully, and it's one of my favourite books. So it's a superhero novel about 2 girls with connected powers, one ostensibly good and one ostensibly evil. But they both get equal focus and empathy throughout this entire story. And as the reader, we become really deeply invested in both perspectives, and it creates this really wildly compelling, really emotional journey, rooting for them both, watching them try to kill each other. And so it's just a really great exploration of the idea of protagonist and antagonist and hero and villain, and the interesting things that you can do that when you separate those roles and archetypes. Okay, I know this is a long one, guys, but hang with me. We are now on to our 3rd and final step of the potent conflict recipe. Step 3. Rephrase your central conflict to find the comfort and conflict zones. So this is the very last step of the potent conflict recipe, and usually the easiest. So in the beginning of this lesson, we spoke about the comfort and conflict zones and the growth zone. And you might be wondering where that is going to come into play. And it's here. So you already know your central conflict, because your central conflict is that pair of conflicting motive goals for your protagonist and antagonist that you've decided on. All we do for this last bit is rephrase it into a comfort zone and a conflict zone so that we can write this central conflict into the plot embryo. Now, let me be clear, whether you have your central conflict written out as these two conflicting motive goals or as a conflict zone, that is two ways of expressing the exact same thing. It doesn't change your central conflict. We're just simply putting it into a different linguistic format that's a bit easier to work with going forward with the rest of your story. So being able to easily express that same central conflict in both these two ways, as the pair of motive goals and as the conflict zone, is very useful for different stages of the story creation process. Think of it like this. Say you have two countries at war. The conflicting motive goals for each country would be to win the war, or perhaps to achieve whatever it is they hope to get out of this war. The conflict zone, on the other hand, would be the name for the war itself. The Cold War, World War I, World War II, whatever it is. So we're referring to the same conflict here, but just coming at it from two slightly different linguistic formats. So, to rephrase your central conflict into your comfort and conflict zone, here's what you're going to do. First, open to a fresh page in your workbook or wherever you do your brainstorming. Second, write your pair of conflicting motive goals at the top, side by side. So let me show you on this page here what you're doing. So you're going to have your protagonist motive goal versus your antagonist motive goal, and underneath this, you're going to write this magic question. How would I describe the conflict between these as a situation? And then we want to just draw a line, or maybe we could do this in a colour or something to delineate that this is the magic question part of our page, and then we're going to be doing the brainstorming underneath. And finally, you're just going to brainstorm that magic question. So you're just going to write out different ways of describing that situation underneath here. So now I want to show you a few examples of pairs of motive goals and how they kind of translate or can be rephrased as the conflict zone. So this first example is from my Transformers story fix video, which will be linked underneath this lesson. So the protagonist in that story, in the version that I created, was Michaela, but also you could say that she was kind of on a team with the Autobots. So our protagonists. So Michaela and the Autobots, their motive goal was to get the Allspark before the Decepticons and save Earth. The antagonist in that story is another group, and it's Megatron kind of at the helm along with the Decepticons. And their motive goal is to get the Allspark before the Autobots and rule Earth. So for those of you who maybe don't remember or don't know this story, the Allspark is basically a MacGuffin. It's this kind of all-powerful object that I think the idea is meant to be that whichever group gets it first, is going to become basically all-powerful, and so the other group really has no chance of getting it back off them once they've got it. And the Autobots, they don't want to use it, they just want to protect it, whereas the Decepticons want to use the Allspark to then enslave the Earth. So we can see how these are in conflict because the Autobots and the Decepticons both can't get the Allspark first. One of those things has to happen, they can't both happen. But also the Earth can't be saved and be free and also be ruled by the Decepticons at the same time. So they're in conflict. So this is our central conflict here, these two motive goals, which are in conflict with each other. So what does that look like as a conflict zone for Michaela? So I had the battle for Earth against the Decepticons. Now, because this is a fairly straightforward kind of one group against another kind of battle, sort of war kind of story, it makes the conflict zone kind of easier. So I could also just give this a proper name. We could call it the War of the Allspark or something like that, which sounds like what Optimus Prime would call it. But yeah, so the idea is here to just be able to say what that situation is. So how do we describe this conflict as a whole? And I think a battle or a war is a pretty good way to describe this conflict. And we can say that it's for Earth against the Decepticons, or we could say the battle for the Allspark or something like that. Which would make Megatron's conflict zone
essentially the same.
So for this assignment, we're only looking for the protagonist's conflict zone, because that's what we need to move forward with our plot embryo. But if you do have an idea of the antagonist's one, that will be useful later on, so you can also do that. But it's not key at the moment. We're focusing again on one plot embryo, the protagonist's plot embryo, so we want to find out the protagonist's conflict zone. Let's look at another example. So my next example is from the movie Into the Spider-Verse, which is actually one of my favourite animated movies, and it has a really perfect example of a really solid plot embryo. So the main character in that is Miles, the protagonist, and the antagonist is Kingpin. So Miles' motive goal is to override Kingpin's Hadron Collider and stop him from destroying the city. And Kingpin's motive goal is to use the collider to reunite with his family, even if it destroys the city. This is a really good example of what I mean when I say that the rules of the world must be such that they can't both get what they want. Because Kingpin's motive goal here isn't actually to destroy the city, even though saving the city from destruction is Miles's motive goal. Kingpin's motive goal is to use the collider for a specific reason. It just happens that the way that the world is set up, the way that the physics of this world is set up, is that he can't use the collider without destroying the city. Like the collider will destroy the city if it is used. So it's a kind of consequence of his motive goal, not the motive goal itself. And that is how we get around. That's why we don't always have to have a kind of villain character like this, straight up just wanting to destroy things for the sake of it. There can be more complexity to that. But the thing that keeps these motive goals in true conflict with each other is the fact that the collider can't be used in the way that Kingpin wants to use it without destroying the city. So for Miles' conflict zone, we have Kingpin's collider scheme. So this is a kind of catch-all term to describe everything that includes every part of Kingpin's plan, his scheme to use this collider in this specific way. So that would include all his plans, all his resources, all the hench people and things that he has at his disposal that he's putting towards that motive goal. But of course, there are other ways to describe this conflict. So you could also simplify it and just call it War with Kingpin. So because there are a bunch of different ways to describe this particular conflict, that's why we do a little brainstorm to see if we can find one that feels the most apt, that feels the most accurate, which feels like it accurately describes the heart of what that conflict is and the situation that the protagonist is in. And for Kingpin's conflict zone, we have Spider-Man's interference in his collider scheme. Or we could just have War with Spider-Man. So I think these top ones, they're actually more specific and they reference the collider specifically. So I think they're probably better in terms of conflict zones. Yeah, so Kingpin, the state of conflict that he is in is that he's trying to just go ahead with this scheme, with this plan, and Spider-Man is getting in the way and he's interfering and trying to stop him. So that is the conflict zone for Kingpin. So I am aware that a lot of my examples tend to be either for superhero stories or like big kind of Hollywood action stories, just because a lot of the time you have really clear protagonists and antagonists, and the motive goals and the conflict zones tend to revolve around physical conflict, which makes them really clear and easy to talk about. But I want to be clear that these rules apply no matter what kind of story you're telling. It does not need to be an action story or a superhero story. It doesn't matter what genre you're working in, these rules still apply. It's just that the kinds of conflict that people are experiencing are going to be different. So I want to give a couple of examples from outside those genres that I know that I tend to use predominantly for most of my examples. So let's take the movie Twister, for instance, just to go back to our hurricane example. So our protagonist there is Helen Hunt's character, whose name I do not remember, and her motive goal is get data from inside the hurricane and survive. And then we have the antagonist, the hurricane. Now I've put hurricane's motive goal in inverted commas here because I understand that linguistically saying that a hurricane has a motive goal can feel a little bit weird. When it comes to antagonists that are kind of forces of nature like this, so in big bad disaster movies or anything where it's really like the antagonist is kind of the laws of nature, it maybe makes more sense often to talk about their motive goal as an imperative. That's the word that jives with me. But yeah, so the hurricane's motive goal, or hurricane's imperative, is destroy everything in its path. And that's going to include Helen Hunt and her hurricane data machine. And so Helen Hunt's conflict zone is going to be the path of the hurricane. Now I want to look at a contemporary, I guess it's a comedy, romance, teen drama, Mean Girls. So the protagonist of that is Cady, and her motive goal is to punish Regina George. Like, her and her friends have this whole scheme to kind of ruin Regina's life because of all the horrible things that she's done, and that's what they're trying to achieve over that story. And then Regina's motive goal, I guess, would be to destroy Cady, or you could say that it is to protect her life from being ruined, or to maintain her rule, I guess, as Queen Bee. And so Cady's conflict zone would be the secret scheme to dethrone and punish Regina. And finally, I'm gonna take a crime example. So I'm gonna use our classic Sherlock Holmes. So our protagonist is Sherlock. So for any given Sherlock Holmes story, that's what we're looking at here. So Sherlock's motive goal is catch the murderer. And the antagonist is just gonna be the murderer of the week. So literally any murderer. And their motive goal is to get away with the murder. And Sherlock's conflict zone then is going to be the case itself, the open murder case. Now, I've run out of space on this page, so I'm not going to write this one down, but you could also do this for the larger kind of Sherlock Holmes arcs. So on any individual, like, small scale story, any individual adventure of Sherlock Holmes, there is obviously an antagonist for that story who is the murderer of the week or whatever kind of case it is. Sometimes it's not a murder, but we also have a larger story between Sherlock as the protagonist and then Moriarty as the antagonist. So in that case, Sherlock's motive goal would be to stop Moriarty doing whatever terrible thing he or she is doing, and then Moriarty's motive goal would be do the terrible thing that I want to do that Sherlock wants me to stop doing, which is different in different stories. And the conflict zone for that, for Sherlock, would be Moriarty's grand scheme to do the terrible thing. And kind of like in the Kingpin case, that's going to include all the different moving parts of that scheme and that plan. Yeah. So that is how we find our conflict zone. So the last step of this is to decide the comfort zone. So obviously you're going to be brainstorming to find what your conflict zone is. Once you've picked that, the very last step is to just look at what the flip side of that would be in terms of the character's comfort zone. So the conflict that you've chosen, the conflict zone that you've chosen, is a new and unfamiliar situation for this protagonist. That's kind of the definition of it. If we go back to here, so they are in their situation of comfort or stasis. They know the rules of the game, everything's familiar, and then they enter the central conflict or the conflict zone for this story. So to find our comfort zone, all we need to do is look at the conflict zone and look at or think about what does normal life look like before they enter the conflict zone. What is normality for this protagonist before they enter this state of conflict? So there we have it, Cinnamon Bun. Conflict, and your assignment for this week. Let's do a little recap. So your assignment for this week is to use the potent conflict recipe and go through the steps. So those steps are: 1, create conflicting motive goals. 2, identify the antagonist. You can see when I don't move the book to write, my writing just goes up like this. I'm just gonna do my normal tilt. And finally, 3, rephrase that into a conflict zone. And your subtask there is, once you have your conflict zone, to just ask, what is the protagonist's normality? Use the conflict zone to figure out what the comfort zone is. And that is your assignment for this week.